Chapter 11, American Capitalism and Progressivism. Part 6, Key Progressivists, Jane Addams and William Jennings Bryan. Jane Addams. There were a huge number of very capable individuals who dedicated themselves to one or another area of the progressivist cause in America, but a few stood out spectacularly, particularly Jane Addams. At one time or another, she was involved with almost every aspect of the progressivist movement. Her mother died when she was only 2, and she grew up deeply influenced by her father, who was a successful Illinois businessman, co-founder of the Illinois Republican Party, and friend of Lincoln. She wanted to be a doctor, helping the poor, but her father paid for her to attend a women's seminary instead. When he died, leaving her $50,000, roughly equivalent to $1.23 million in today's dollars, she and her family moved to Philadelphia, where she and her siblings could all attend medical school. But she was forced back to Illinois because of severe back problems she was experiencing. An operation later and a 2-year tour of Europe to recover, emotionally as well as physically, taught her that she did not need to be a doctor to help the poor. While in London, she became inspired by Toynbee Hall, where the British from various social classes lived together in some degree of harmony. This would become the model for her when she used her money in 1889 to purchase a rundown mansion, the Hull House, in Chicago. Other women of wealth joined her in the enterprise of bringing together women of different social or national backgrounds in an effort to demonstrate the possibilities of a life that reached closer to utopian proportions. Then, with additional funding, she added the feature of both an art gallery, with art classes offered, and a library to the Hull House to bring working-class children into contact with the higher cultural realm. Little by little, the Hull House expanded itself in the Chicago multi-ethnic neighborhood until it included 13 separate buildings and a playground. The Hull House thus became a showcase for experiments in social improvement, so vital to the progressivist movement, and she herself entered the world of progressivist politics in helping to start up the Progressive Party that sponsored Theodore Roosevelt in his third party run for the U.S. presidency in 1912. From her work with neighborhood families, she expanded into the world of public health, public morals, that is, fighting rampant prostitution, and the increasing involvement of women as moral crusaders, cleaning up Chicago's society and politics, especially when that touched on women and children. Her intimate relationships were all with women, something that today would qualify her as a lesbian, though the practice then among unmarried women was so common that no label was applied at the time to her lifestyle. In fact, she saw herself as a strong Christian, a Presbyterian, who also attended a Unitarian church and had an excellent working relationship with the local Jewish community. She also was an anti-imperialist and a pacifist, and when World War I broke out in 1914, her activities led her to being elected chairman of the Women's Peace Party. She subsequently joined the leadership of the International Congress of Women, which gathered at The Hague in neutral Netherlands in April of 1915 to search for a way to end the war. Her pacifism, in turn, brought her much harsh criticism when, in 1917, the U.S. joined the war effort and the spirit of militant nationalism swept the nation. After the war, she was elected chairman of several international women's groups focused on securing world peace, by this time with the approval and support of U.S. President Coolidge. In 1931, she was voted the Nobel Peace Prize by the awards committee virtually unanimously, capping a long career which exemplified in so many ways the very heart of progressivism. 4 years later, she died, deeply mourned by the American nation, which saw in her only goodness and inspiring hope, much needed at a time when America was going through the Great Depression. William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, a hero or a major social annoyance? Another key progressive was a man who ran as Democratic Party nominee for the U.S. presidency 3 times, though he was not successful in any of those 3 attempts. William Jennings Bryan was something of a common man who identified himself with rural and small-town America, in opposition to the wealthier and more sophisticated segment of society, whose arrogance and greed he claimed were destroying the democratic foundations of America. To the latter group, however, Bryan was simply a living, breathing symbol of the grievous ignorance of an American society that needed deep reforming. His unflinching Christian faith and his confidence in the long political social Christian legacy, which he often romanticized, that touched the heart of the common man, were exactly the things that stirred rather fully the wrath of the intellectual progressivists of the newly rising secular humanist variety. Yet Bryan, in his own way, was very much a progressivist, just operating from a different vantage point than many of the other segments of the progressivist movement. Bryan was born in rural southern Illinois in 1860 to a Baptist mother and a Methodist father, and went his own way religiously because of a Christian revival when he was 14 that led him to be baptized as a Presbyterian, the most important day in his life, he would say. His father was an avid Jackson Democrat and an Illinois circuit judge, and the family lived comfortably and respectably. In order to prepare him for college, he was sent in 1874 to attend Whipple Academy in Jacksonville, connected to the Presbyterian Illinois College, which he also attended after completing high school at the academy. Following graduation in 1881, he was the class valedictorian. He entered Union Law College in Chicago, that's the future Northwestern University School of Law, and after graduating, taught high school and married Mary Elizabeth Baird, 1884, and then settled in Jacksonville, where both William and his wife Mary practiced law. Greater opportunity beckoned from fast-growing Lincoln, Nebraska, and the Bryans moved there in 1887, where he soon became involved in local politics. He ran for U.S. Congress in 1890 and was carried into office with the landslide victory of the Democratic Party that year. He was re-elected 2 years later, but then in 1894 he lost a bid to become one of Nebraska's 2 U.S. senators when the Republicans took control of the state legislature. At that time, senators were still elected by the state legislatures. But he had a crusader's heart, had limitless energy, and a commanding voice that put him on the lecture circuit, where he could spread his message of social reform. A number of issues found their way to the heart of his lectures, particularly the gold-silver crisis that had the nation deeply divided at the time, when a vast oversupply of government-purchased silver resulted from the 1890 Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and nervous investors moved to demand gold in payment rather than silver, causing a run on gold, and the Panic of 1893. President Cleveland repealed the act in 1893, causing the value of silver to drop away drastically. While this saved the day for America's major industrialists and financiers, it left the American farmers and miners in a terrible situation, as banks wanted payment in stable currency, that is gold, that the farmers did not have, especially at a time of greatly reduced food prices caused by a massive production of farm products, and the miners found themselves simply out of work. The 1896 presidential election. It was Bryan who took up the cause of the farmer and miner, delivering powerful speeches on the lecture circuit attacking the great gain of the rich with their gold strategy. Bryan actually stated doing so on the floor of Congress in 1893 when he was a representative opposed to the repeal of the Sherman Act. Then in 1896 he mesmerized the Democratic National Convention when he delivered the fiery speech in support of the little people of the nation, ending his speech with that famous challenge, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The speech changed the entire course of the convention, and the young Bryan, just 36 years old, was chosen by the Democratic Party, Cleveland was out, to be its presidential nominee for the 1896 national election, running up against the Republican McKinley. While McKinley sat on his porch receiving visitors, a tradition expected of serious candidates, Bryan took to the road to deliver more of his speeches, 500 of them, fully expecting this to turn the election in his favor. Of course, this election was not just about gold, but also about the huge industrial and financial trusts that control the nation's economy, the railroads that practiced monopolistic pricing that crushed the farmer, and the politicians in the pockets of the big money boys. But the economy was settling down at this point, and Bryan did not have the impact that he was hoping for. As we've already seen, he lost to McKinley, gaining 46.7% of the popular vote to McKinley's 51%, carrying 22 of the less populous southern and western states compared to McKinley's victory in 23 of the vastly more populous states of the Northeast and Midwest and the Pacific Coast, and thus taking a beating on the Electoral College, 271 to only 176. Still, it was a respectable result, so much so that he would become the party's candidate again in 1900. The question of imperialism and the Spanish-American War. In the meantime, Bryan, like the rest of the nation, got caught up in the growing problems with Spain over its cruel actions taken to suppress rebellion in the remaining Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Bryan was an ardent anti-imperialist. He considered imperialism to be nothing more than crude bullying, justified by Darwinist rhetoric, which he also detested, about the necessity of the strong dominating the weak. Yet he was himself caught up in the rising democratic idealism that made democracy the answer to the world's problems. Thus he put aside his anti-imperialism and took up the American nationalist cause of intervening in the Cuban and Puerto Rican rebellion to help those two lands acquire their own democracies, drawing criticism from his anti-imperialist supporters who saw such American involvement as merely another form of imperialism. It also brought sneers from his detractors for his being so confused about exactly where he stood on the matters. But when a piece of follow-up legislation to the Treaty of Paris, calling for independence for the Philippines, failed to pass in Congress, Bryan began once again to take up his anti-imperialism stance. The 1900 presidential election. Indeed, anti-imperialism was his main theme at the 1900 Democratic National Convention, where Bryan was again chosen to be the party's presidential candidate. Then, once again, he became a whirlwind of activity, delivering an endless round of speeches denouncing American imperialism and pressing still for a return to silver currency. Yet at this point, the nation had largely moved on past the issue and was enjoying the full dinner pail that McKinley reminded Americans that they had come to enjoy under the last 4 years of his presidency. Consequently, Bryan's results in his rematch in 1900 with McKinley were an even greater disappointment to Bryan and his supporters than they'd been in 1896. At this point, Bryan devoted himself to the lecture circuit, especially at the rural chautauquas that economically comfortable people attended, especially in the summers to escape the stifling heat of American cities, where whole families encountered a full program of entertainment and cultural exposure. Clearly, Bryan was the most popular of the speakers, with his coverage of subjects running from social reform to the Christian faith, especially the latter. One of his favorite subjects was Darwinism and the threat that it posed to American morality. He was less interested in the debate raised by Darwinists over the Bible as scientific truth, so-called inerrancy issue, than he was in the way the growing Darwinist mindset of modern culture was undermining Christian morality. He even went abroad with his lectures, and just touring, from 1904 to 1906, in a sense taking a vacation from American political issues. The 1908 presidential election. But when the 1908 election rolled around, and Roosevelt was stepping down from the presidency in favor of his friend Taft, the Democratic Party again looked to Bryan to run for the presidency. Bryan had a comprehensive progressivist program to run on, including a constitutional amendment calling for federal government income and inheritance taxes, full disclosure of corporate contributions to political campaigns, the program of the initiative and referendum, that is, citizens having the right to initiate legislation on their own, and more trust busting. But Bryan could not excite the electorate with his program, aimed at an opponent, Taft, who himself was a recognized trust buster and inheritor of the Rooseveltian mantle. Thus, Bryan's third and last attempt at gaining the presidency brought him even more disappointing results than the 2 times earlier. It would be his last run for the presidency. Bryan's appointment as Secretary of State in 1913. Once again, Bryan returned to the lecture circuit. But when the 1912 election came around, he chose to merely support a Democratic Party candidate rather than be that candidate himself. The convention itself was split among a number of contenders, and finally Bryan threw his weight to New Jersey Governor and former Princeton University professor and president Woodrow Wilson, who, with Bryan's support, finally on the 46th ballot was chosen as the party's candidate. Wilson subsequently elected to the presidency on a mere plurality of votes because of a split among the Republicans between the followers of Taft and the followers of Roosevelt, in turn appointed Bryan to the position of Secretary of State. Although this was considered the most important of the cabinet positions, actually under Wilson, Bryan would be relegated to a very secondary role in the conduct of the Secretary's usual business of foreign affairs, because Wilson wanted to conduct American foreign policy himself. But we will leave the rest of Bryan's story for chapters that follow.